The point of these masterclass videos is to really focus on a chord tone based approach to improvisation, where we're not just playing the chord tones, but we're always focusing in towards those chord tones. And to that end, I'm going to introduce a concept that is also scale based, but it's scale based with sort of a set of rules behind it. The idea that I want to talk about is called a bebop scale. And a bebop scale is something that is a sort of specially constructed scale that'll make sure that you're always focusing towards those chord tones. So let's have an example of this. Let's use the B flat 7 chord at the beginning of the blues. So traditionally, we would associate a B flat mixolydian scale with that B flat 7 chord. And that's great. It has a lot of notes that fit really well. There are a couple notes in the scale that are a little bit dangerous as well. So at the beginning of the masterclass, I talked about, for example, that E flat. In other words, the 4th degree of the mixolydian scale is really a pretty dissonant note on it. But if we're careful about where we rhythmically place our chord tones and where we have our other notes so that they're sort of passing tones and oftentimes approach tones, for example, we can use those scales and still sound like we're really playing the changes. But we need a little bit of an alteration to make this into a bebop scale. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a note. So here's the reason. Bebop scales are 8-note scales with this added note. And you have a really nice sort of mathematical consequence from this, which is before our mixolydian scale was 7 notes. And that gets you sort of a problem. If you play that scale and you just have a line going up and maybe down, weaving around, at the beginning of that line, if we're talking in 8th notes, the chord tones are going to land on downbeats. So for example, if I did something like this on a B flat 7 chord, 2, 3. All right, so if those were 8th notes, I would have the B flat, D, F, and A flat on downbeats. That's great. That's going to make it sound like I'm really playing the changes and emphasizing the harmony. But what happens if I continue? So I just kept going up, and right there I ended on a concert E flat on a downbeat. That's that 4, that note that we know is sort of questionable and sounds pretty dissonant against the chord sometimes. So that happens because we have a 7-note scale, and those 7 notes don't really fit very well over our bar of 4/4. But if we put an extra note into this scale in between the flat 7 and the root, that's going to give us an 8-note scale. And all of a sudden, as long as I start that scale on a downbeat with a chord tone, and I just use the scale, I can ascend and descend as much as I want, and it's going to keep me on chord tones. So again, on that B flat 7 chord, it would sound like this. And you see at the end, I ended up back on the root, even if I changed directions. All right, so as long as I'm using this bebop scale, it really keeps me sort of honest in terms of the harmony and where my chord tones are appearing and where my passing tones are appearing. So there are quite a few different bebop scales depending on the chord type that you're using. In this chapter, I'd just like to introduce 2 of them. One is that bebop scale we're going to use on a dominant 7th chord. So that bebop scale is where you just take the mixolydian scale and you add an extra note in between the flat 7 and the root. So that extra note is going to be your major 7th in there. And also the bebop scale we would use on a minor 7 chord, which normally on minor 7 chords, we associate a Dorian scale. So we're going to use basically the same formula. We're going to take our Dorian scale and we're going to add an extra note in between the flat 7 and the root. So that extra note is going to be the major 7. Okay, so I'm going to play the example that I have here written over the blues. And I will say that most of the time when you hear the bebop scale sort of in the wild, in real life situations, you may only hear 2 or 3 notes of it at a time. It's not usually something that's played in a big scale like this. It's more sort of connective tissue, connecting other ideas. And in this concept, I'm going to play a couple longer stretches of this because I really want you to get the concept down, but be aware that it's going to sound a little bit unusual because of that. A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so you've probably noticed too that I'm, of course, adding in this new concept, but I'm building it on top of what we've done before. So, for example, you're going to find examples of approach tones in that solo. You're going to find an example of a tritone substitution. You may have heard that when I was playing it. It's over the concert E flat 7 chord there in the middle of the form. And then there's also the bebop scale stuff, that new information. Okay, so we need to talk about what to practice with this. So the first thing is you may just want to practice these bebop scales on their own. So the 2 that we're dealing with right now are the Mixolydian bebop scale and the Dorian bebop scale. And you could practice those not only with the chord changes that we're using here on the blues, but you could practice those in all 12 keys on your instrument. So once you have those scales under your fingers, both ascending and descending, then you could practice those scales alone over the changes, not improvising. So for example, I could play something like this over these blues chord changes. A 2, a 1, 2, 3. All right, and I could play that through the chord changes. That would be a great exercise to get it under your fingers. By the way, there's something on that bar that I was about to get to just now that I should point out, which is anytime you have a 2-5, very common chord progression in jazz, we can get away with playing the bebop scale from just the 5 chord over that. So that upcoming bar was going to be a 2-5 in the key of E flat, meaning F minor 7 to B flat 7. I can play a B flat 7 bebop scale over that whole bar, which you'll see in the solo example is exactly what I did there. So once you've practiced those scales on their own, you can start weaving in that concept into your improvisation, trying little segments of it, maybe planning out specific parts where you want to use it. In the practice, you might find yourself doing what I did here on the example, which is maybe overusing it and using these scale segments a little longer than you would normally use. But then as you get familiar with it, you may want to dial it back. So it's just maybe 2 or 3, 4 notes at a time of these bebop scales connecting other ideas that you have in your solo.